The moment Daniel Bailey set eyes on Susanna Bishop through the dirty window of the Abilene stagecoach office, he knew with a cold certainty in the pit of his stomach that delivering her to Harlan Creed was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, and he had once dragged a wounded man 3 miles through a Kansas blizzard. She was standing beside a single battered trunk, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, her chin lifted at an angle that said she was frightened but determined not to show it. She wore a gray traveling dress that was clean despite obvious mending at the hem, and she held a small reticule in both gloved hands as though it contained everything she had left to her name, which, as Daniel would later learn, it very nearly did. He pushed open the door and stepped into the dusty office, pulling his hat from his head in a gesture that was more habit than courtesy, though he meant it all the same. The man behind the counter, a wiry fellow named Otis who smelled of pipe tobacco and old receipts, waved Daniel over before he could even speak. "Bailey, right on time. This here is Miss Susanna Bishop, come all the way from St. Louis by rail and then by stage." Otis leaned on the counter with both elbows. "She is headed to the Creed Ranch, same as you already know. Mr. Creed sent word you would be the one to see her there safe." Daniel looked at Susanna properly then. She was looking right back at him with eyes the color of dark amber, steady and measuring, the way a person looks when they have learned not to trust too quickly. "Miss Bishop," he said. "Mr. Bailey," she replied. Her voice was low and even, with a faint note of something he could not quite name. Not quite fear, more like resignation wearing the clothes of composure. He cleared his throat and turned back to Otis. "We will head out first light tomorrow." "Too late in the day to make it past Redstone Creek before dark." Otis scratched at his beard. "Mr. Creed wanted her delivered by Thursday." "Then Mr. Creed should have sent for her sooner," Daniel said, and the flatness in his voice closed the subject. He arranged for Susanna to stay the night at the Abilene boarding house run by a stout widow named Mrs. Clara Dunmore, who charged fair rates and kept a clean house and did not ask questions, which Daniel appreciated greatly. He carried Susanna's trunk himself, which was heavier than it looked, and said very little during the short walk through Abilene's main street. It was the summer of 1873, and Abilene was still buzzing with the cattle trade, though the great drives were already beginning to slow as the railheads pushed further west. The street was wide and rutted, alive with the smell of horses and dust and frying meat from the saloon 2 blocks down. Cowboys in from the trail lounged on hitching posts and boardwalk edges, watching the world with the languid contentment of men recently paid. Susanna walked without looking at them. She walked with her eyes straight ahead, and Daniel found himself walking a half-step closer to her than he needed to, close enough that any man watching would understand she was not alone. At Mrs. Dunmore's door he set the trunk down and held his hat in both hands. "Supper is served at 6, he said. "I will come for you at dawn. Have your trunk ready outside this door and we will load it on the mule." She met his eyes again. "How long is the ride to the Creed Ranch?" 2 days, day and a half if the weather holds." Something passed across her face, a brief contraction like a shadow crossing water. "I see," she said. "Miss Bishop." He hesitated, which was unusual for him. He was a man who generally knew what he intended to say before he opened his mouth. "Have you met Mr. Creed before, in person?" She looked at him very directly. "No, we corresponded." "He answered my advertisement in the matrimonial news." She paused. "He seemed adequate in his letters." Adequate. Daniel turned the word over in his mind the whole walk back to the livery stable where he bedded his horse, a big roan gelding named Scout, for the night. Adequate, not kind, not warm, not good. Adequate. Harlan Creed was, by most practical measures, a successful man. He ran a cattle operation 20 miles south of Abilene on good flat land near the Smoky Hill River, a solid house of stone and timber, 20-some employees, and a reputation for meeting his debts promptly. He was also 44 years old, twice widowed, with a temper that the men who worked for him kept their distance from, and a way of acquiring things, land, horses, water rights, that left people feeling they had gotten the worst end of the deal even when they could not quite explain why. Daniel had ridden for Creed 2 seasons back. He had left without incident but also without looking back. He lay on his bunk in the livery's back room that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to Scout shift his weight in the stall, and he thought about Susanna Bishop standing in the stagecoach office with her chin up and her reticule in both hands and her eyes like amber in lamplight, saying that Harlan Creed seemed adequate. He thought about a woman traveling alone from St. Louis to marry a man she had never met because her options had apparently narrowed to that single corridor. He thought about all of it for a long time, and then he stopped thinking and went to sleep because there was nothing to be done. She was going to Creed's ranch. He was being paid to take her there. That was the sum of it. Dawn came gray and quiet, the way Kansas dawns often did, with a thin mist sitting on the grass and the smell of the river somewhere to the east. Daniel was at Mrs. Dunmore's door at the agreed hour and found Susanna already on the step with her trunk beside her, fully dressed and composed, her bonnet tied neatly. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder and a small wooden box tucked under her arm. "What is in the box?" he asked, not to pry but because he was calculating weight for the mule. "Books," she said, and something in her tone dared him to find that impractical. He did not. He secured the trunk and the box on the mule, a steady gray animal he had hired from the livery, and brought Scout around. He helped Susanna onto a spare horse, a calm chestnut mare the livery man called Dolly, and they rode out of Abilene as the first true light was beginning to spread across the prairie in long, pale stripes. They rode without speaking for the first hour, which was not unusual for Daniel. He was comfortable with silence, had in fact spent large portions of his adult life in it, moving between cattle jobs and brief stints as a deputy, and the occasional surveying contract that took him into territories where conversation was not available. He was 31 years old and had never been particularly lonely, or at least had never let himself notice it long enough to call it that. But the silence with Susanna was different from the silences he was used to. It had texture. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound just at the edge of hearing, something present and waiting. It was she who broke it, about 2 hours out of town when the mist had burned off and the prairie had opened into its full summer color, the grass gold and green and rolling in the wind like a slow green sea. "How long have you done this?" she asked. "This sort of work, guiding people?" He considered the question honestly. "Since I was 23. Before that I drove cattle up from Texas. Before that I worked my father's farm in Missouri until he did not need me anymore. He sold the farm. He died," Daniel said, without particular drama. "My mother 2 years before him. I was the youngest of 5 and the only one still at home. The farm went to my brother James and I went west. I am sorry about your parents. It was some years ago now." She was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet now, more thoughtful than closed. "What about you?" he asked, because it seemed only fair, and also because he found he genuinely wanted to know. She kept her eyes on the grass ahead. "My father was a bookkeeper in St. Louis. He died in January of last year. My mother had already been gone 5 years. I had a position as a school teacher, but the school closed when the town's funding dried up and my father's debts." She paused, the way people pause when a number is too large to speak aloud easily. "There was not much left. I stayed as long as I could with my father's sister, but she has her own family and her own difficulties. So I placed the advertisement." And Creed answered. Several men answered. He had the best land and the clearest offer. She said it simply, practically, but he heard underneath it the particular kind of courage that is not heroic, not dramatic, just the quiet bravery of a person who has run out of choices and keeps going anyway. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, but he was thinking about it for a very long time after. They made good time through the morning. The prairie lay flat and open around them, interrupted here and there by low swells of ground, and the occasional stand of cottonwood marking where water ran beneath the surface. Meadowlarks called from the grass. The sky above Kansas was the particular shade of blue that seems too vivid to be entirely real, as though someone had painted it with an overly optimistic hand. Around midday, they stopped beside a creek to water the horses and eat the provisions Daniel had packed, dried biscuits and salt pork, and a pair of apples he had bought from the general store. He spread a blanket on the grass, and Susanna sat on one edge of it while he sat on the other, and they ate with the pleasant, simple hunger of people who have been outdoors in moving air all morning. She opened her canvas bag and produced a small notebook, which she opened and wrote something in while they ate, quickly and with absorption, as though catching a thought before it escaped. "What do you write?" he asked. She looked up, and there was a brief flicker of surprise, as though she had not expected the question. "Observations, things I notice. It is a habit from when I was teaching. I used to write down things that happened that I thought might be useful to explain to children someday." She paused. "I suppose it is still a habit even without the children. Can you still teach?" he asked. "Once you are settled." Something moved across her face. "That would depend on Mr. Creed." He let that sit without pressing it, but it settled in him like a stone dropped into water, the ripples spreading quietly outward. They were back in the saddle by early afternoon, making their way southwest along a trail that ran parallel to the Smoky Hill River. The afternoon heat built slowly, a dry, honest heat that smelled of grass and dust, and the distant suggestion of cattle somewhere to the south. Daniel rode slightly ahead, watching the horizon with the habitual alertness of a man who had been in enough situations to know that the prairie's peaceful appearance was not a guarantee of its contents. He had his rifle in the scabbard and his Colt on his hip, not because he expected trouble on this particular ride, but because not carrying them would have felt like going out without his boots. Around 3 in the afternoon, the trail dipped toward the river, and they rode through a grove of cottonwoods where the shade was sudden and cool. Susanna made a small sound of pleasure at the coolness that she seemed not to have intended to make out loud, and then looked sideways at him with a faint color in her cheeks. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Nothing to beg," he said. "It is hotter than I would like it to be." She smiled then, briefly, just a quick upward movement at the corners of her mouth, and it changed her face in a way that he registered and filed away without examining it too closely. They camped that night on the far side of a low rise above the river, where the ground was dry and the grass was short, and there was a clear view in most directions, which Daniel always preferred. He built a small fire and made coffee in the battered tin pot he carried in his saddlebag, and he heated beans in a cast iron pan, while Susanna sat close to the warmth of the fire with her shawl around her shoulders, writing in her notebook by firelight. The night sounds of the prairie settled around them, the insects and the distant call of an owl and the soft movement of the horses on their picket line. "Do you like it out here?" she asked suddenly, looking up from her writing. "The prairie, do you actually like it, or is it simply where the work is?" He considered the question seriously. "Both," he said, "but more than both, I think I would miss it if I went somewhere else. The size of it, the way you can see weather coming from 50 miles off. The way the grass sounds in the wind." He stopped because he was not usually a man who talked much about what he felt, and the words had come out more easily than he expected, which surprised him. She was watching him with those amber eyes, patient and interested. "In St. Louis," she said, "I sometimes felt like the buildings were holding the sky up, like if they all fell down at once there would suddenly be too much of it." She looked up at the Kansas sky above them, enormous and star-scattered. "Here it already is too much of it. And it is extraordinary." He looked up with her. The Milky Way was a river of light from one horizon to the other, undimmed by any town glow, the stars so numerous and vivid they seemed crowded. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, and he did not examine why it was comfortable, only that it was. He rolled out his bedroll a respectable distance from where she had arranged hers beside the fire, and he lay on his back looking at the stars for a long time before he slept. He was thinking, though he would not have admitted it, about the fact that in approximately 36 hours he was going to pull up to the gate of Harlan Creed's stone house and help Susanna Bishop down from the chestnut mare and hand her, effectively, to a man whose idea of adequate was a fine description if you were talking about a tool or a fence post. He slept eventually, but it was not a restful sleep. Morning came with a red sky in the east that Daniel watched with professional attention. Red morning sky on the Kansas prairie in July was not necessarily cause for alarm, but it was worth watching. He had seen summer storms build out of clear mornings before, fast and violent and indifferent to the plans of men and women on horseback. He had coffee ready before Susanna woke, and when she came out from the shelter of her bedroll looking somewhat rumpled and entirely human, he handed her a tin cup without ceremony. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at him over the rim with an expression of such genuine gratitude that he had to look back at the fire. "Red sky," she observed. "I noticed. My father used to say red sky at morning, sailor take warning." "Your father was not wrong," Daniel said. "We should make Redstone Creek by mid-morning and we can decide there whether to push on or wait it out." She nodded, practical and uncomplaining, and went to see to her morning preparations with the efficient economy of movement that he had noticed was characteristic of her. She did not fuss. She did not require assistance for things she could do herself. She did not fill silence with unnecessary words. He found all of these things remarkable, and, if he was honest with himself, deeply appealing, though he was not quite ready to be that honest with himself yet. They rode through the morning with the red sky fading behind them and a bank of cloud building to the northwest, which was the direction Daniel was watching. The prairie rolled gently here, more varied than the flat land around Abilene, cut through by the occasional gully where previous seasons' rain had carved channels in the earth. Around 10 in the morning, as they were approaching the cottonwoods that marked Redstone Creek, Susanna's horse Dolly shied suddenly at something in the grass, a startled jackrabbit that exploded out from under the mare's hooves, and Susanna, who was not an expert rider though she was a competent one, lurched in the saddle and grabbed at the pommel. Daniel was beside her before Dolly had taken 2 more skittering steps, his hand already on the mare's bridle, steadying her with a firm, quiet pressure that horses responded to. Dolly settled almost immediately, blowing through her nose and stamping, but calm. "All right," Daniel said, looking at Susanna. She had righted herself in the saddle. There was a high color in her cheeks and her bonnet was pushed back at an angle and she was breathing with the particular deliberateness of someone who has just had a fright and is declining to acknowledge it. "Perfectly," she said. He was close enough to see that her hands were trembling slightly on the reins. Without thinking about it, he reached over and covered them briefly with one of his own, just for a moment, just a steadying weight. She looked at his hand. Then she looked at him. The trembling stopped. "Thank you," she said quietly. He withdrew his hand and moved Scout back to his customary position, and they rode on toward the creek without either of them mentioning it again. But the warmth of his hand over her stayed in Susanna's awareness like the afterglow of something bright, and she wrote 3 lines about it in her notebook when they stopped at the creek to water the horses, though she would not have been able to explain exactly what she was trying to capture. They watered the horses and filled Daniel's canteen from the clear-running creek, and Daniel looked at the cloud bank to the northwest, which had grown and darkened during the 2 hours since he had first noticed it. He could see the distant curtain of rain beneath it, a gray smudge between cloud and earth, moving in a direction he did not love. "We can shelter here," he said, "in the cottonwoods. Wait it out, or we push on and try to make it to the Anders homestead before it hits. There is a family there, good people, they have sheltered me before." She looked at the clouds, then at him. "How far is the Anders homestead? 4 miles south, maybe slightly more. And if we stay here in the trees, we stay until it passes, that could be 2 hours, could be 4. She did not take long to decide. "Let us try for the homestead. 4 miles is not a great distance." He almost smiled. "No, it is not," he agreed, "though Kansas weather has its own ideas about time and distance. They made it to within a mile of the Anders homestead before the storm caught them. It came in fast and loud, the way Kansas storms always seem to, as though the sky had simply decided it was done with delay. The wind hit first, a sudden wall of it that flattened the grass and sent Susanna's bonnet straining against its ribbons, and then the rain came horizontal and immediate and cold, a real frog strangler, as the cowboys called it. Daniel pulled Scout alongside Dolly and raised his voice above the wind. "Stay close to me. The homestead is straight ahead, just over that rise." He pulled his slicker from his saddlebag and held it out to her. "Take this." She started to protest. He gave her a look that ended the protest, and she took the slicker and pulled it around her shoulders as best she could while keeping her horse moving. They came over the rise at a fast trot, and Daniel could see the Anders place below. A low stone house and a weathered barn and a split-rail fence line, smoke coming sideways from the chimney in the wind. He led them straight to the barn, sliding off Scout and getting the door open before Susanna had fully pulled Dolly to a stop. She was soaked through despite the slicker, her dark hair plastered to her temples, her dress wet from the knees down where the slicker did not reach. She slid from the saddle, and he caught her arm as her boot slipped in the mud, steadying her, and she grabbed his forearm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. They got the horses inside and the barn door latched against the wind, and stood for a moment in the relative quiet of the hay-smelling interior, both of them breathing hard. Outside, the storm hammered the roof with an enthusiasm that suggested it had nowhere else to be. Susanna looked at him. Then she looked down at herself. Water was running from her hem in small streams. Then she looked back up at him, and to his considerable surprise she laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound, startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of the situation. He had not been prepared for what her laugh did to the quality of the air around him. It was warm and real, and the kind of sound that made a person want to hear it again as soon as it stopped. He found himself grinning, which was unusual enough that his own face surprised him. "Well," she said, catching her breath, "I have arrived in Kansas in genuine fashion. The prairie does like a proper introduction," he said. The barn door opened from the house side, and a big fair-haired man in his 40s came in with a lantern and an expression of welcome that was entirely genuine. "Bailey, I thought that was your roan I saw coming over the rise. Getting out of the wet, both of you. Martha is already putting water on." Eric Anders was Norwegian-born, had come to Kansas in 1865 with his wife Martha and 3 children, and had built his homestead on a section of Homestead Act land through what Daniel privately considered the most disciplined stubbornness he had ever witnessed. He was a large, warm, practical man who treated guests with the open-handed hospitality of someone who remembered what it was to need it. Martha Anders was small and fair and moved fast, the way people who manage large families and livestock and homesteads in the Kansas prairie develop a kind of efficient perpetual motion. She took one look at Susanna dripping in her barn doorway and had her inside the house, out of her wet things, and wrapped in a dry quilt within 10 minutes, an organizational accomplishment that impressed Daniel, who had seen cavalry operations conducted with less efficiency. He changed into his spare dry shirt in the barn and came into the house to find Susanna at the Anders kitchen table, transformed, her dark hair loose and drying around her shoulders, the quilt around her, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and she was talking to Martha with the easy warmth of a woman who liked people, and understood that most of them, if you listened to them genuinely, had interesting things to say. The 3 Anders children, 2 boys of 12 and 10 and a girl of 7, orbited the table with the fascinated energy of children who did not often have visitors, and Susanna spoke to them with a directness and interest that made them bloom visibly. Daniel sat and drank his coffee and watched her, and he thought about her advertisement in the matrimonial news, about her trunk full of books, about her notebook and her writing, about the way she had laughed in the barn, and he thought about Harlan Creed's stone house on the Smoky Hill River. The storm blew itself out in the late afternoon and left the air clean and cool and smelling of wet grass, the sky a pale washed blue. Eric Anders walked Daniel out to the barn while Martha and Susanna sat together, and Eric smoked his pipe in the barn doorway looking at the dripping fence lines. "She is a good woman," Eric said, with the directness of a man who was not given to subtlety. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "Where are you taking her?" "Creed's ranch." Eric was quiet for a moment. He pulled on his pipe. "I have heard things about Creed." "Most people have," Daniel said. Eric looked at him. "And the woman knows what she is going into. She knows what was in his letters." Eric nodded slowly, the way people nod when they understand the gap between those two things and do not know how to cross it. They stayed the night at the Anders homestead, Daniel on a cot in the barn, and Susanna in the spare room that had once belonged to Eric's older daughter before she married and moved to Wichita. And Daniel lay on the cot in the hay-smelling dark, and had, for the first time, a fully honest conversation with himself about what he was doing. He was taking a woman he respected, and was rapidly coming to feel considerably more than respect for, to a man she was going to marry. A man who had twice been widowed and had a temper and a tendency to acquire things, and he was doing this because he had been hired to do it, and because it was her decision to make and not his. Both of those things were true. Also true was the fact that Susanna Bishop had laughed in his barn with her hair wet and her dress soaked to the knee, and it had been the best sound he had heard in years, possibly ever. Also true was the fact that she had looked at him across a fire under the Kansas stars and talked about buildings holding up the sky and the extraordinary size of open space, and he had felt in that moment less alone than he had felt in a decade of comfortable solitude. He put his arm over his eyes in the dark and told himself that none of this was relevant. She was a grown woman who had made an arrangement. He was a hired man doing a job. Tomorrow they would ride the last 12 miles to Creed's ranch, and he would do what he was paid to do, and that would be the end of it. He repeated this to himself with some force and eventually slept, but his sleep was troubled by things he could not quite remember in the morning, only that they had left him with an ache in the chest that coffee and biscuits at the Anders breakfast table did not entirely address. Martha Anders put up a proper breakfast that would have satisfied twice the number of people present: eggs and salt pork and biscuits with sorghum. And she packed a bundle for the road that Susanna accepted with such genuine gratitude that Martha pressed her hand and said something quietly that Daniel did not hear. And Susanna's expression when she looked up was complicated in a way that he could see but not read. They rode out at 8 in the morning into the clean, rain-washed world. The grass was vivid green gold, every blade beaded with water that caught the morning light, and the sky was the deep, unclouded blue that comes after a storm has cleaned everything. The air smelled of grass and earth and something living and specific to this particular stretch of Kansas prairie. Susanna rode with her bonnet pushed back on her shoulders, her face turned up slightly to the sun, and she looked free in a way that was hard to define and harder to stop looking at. They talked more easily this morning than they had the whole ride. Something in the storm and the Anders' kitchen and the night of shelter had shifted the atmosphere between them, dissolved some formal distance. She told him about the school where she had taught, a single-room building with 23 children ranging from 6 to 14, how she had loved the work of it, the specific satisfaction of watching understanding arrive on a child's face. She was funny about it, dry and warm at once, a combination he had not encountered often. He told her about his years driving cattle, about one particular drive up from Texas in 1868, when they had been caught in a thunderstorm that spooked the whole herd, and he had spent the better part of the night chasing cattle across the dark Texas countryside on a horse that was equally terrified and considerably faster than any cattle had a right to be. She laughed at that too, and he filed it alongside the barn laugh, gathering them. They were so absorbed in talking that it was a while before either of them noticed that they had ridden beyond the trail marker that indicated 12 miles to the Creed property line. The familiar landscape, which Daniel knew from his 2 seasons of working for Creed, had been coming into view around them gradually, and he had not been paying it the attention he should have. He pulled Scout up and looked at the distant stone structure against the horizon, still a few miles south. Creed's house, Creed's land, and his chest did something complicated and unwelcome. Susanna had pulled Dolly up beside him. She had seen what he was looking at. Her face went still, the warmth of the last few hours condensing back into the composed, held quality he had first seen in the stagecoach office. "Is that it?" she asked. "That is it," he said. She sat looking at it. "It is a substantial house," she said with careful neutrality. "Stone and timber. He built it himself in the earlier years. It is a well-made house." She nodded, absorbing this information. He held his reins in both hands and looked at the horizon. And then he heard himself say, quietly and without having planned it, "You do not have to go." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the middle distance because he did not trust himself to look at her while he said the rest of it. "What I mean is, this is still your decision to make. The correspondence, the arrangement, it is paper. It is not law until you stand in front of a preacher, and you have not done that yet. If there is anywhere else you could go, anyone else you could write to, I would take you back to Abilene myself." He paused. "That is overstepping, I know that, and I apologize for it. But I wanted to say it once so that you know it is true." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them, that constant, gentle Kansas percussion. "There is nowhere else," she said finally, and her voice was even, but he could hear what it cost her to say it that way, flatly and finally, closing a door. He nodded. He turned Scout back toward the trail. And then she said, in a different voice entirely, lower and more uncertain than anything he had heard from her yet, "What would I do in Abilene?" He turned back to look at her then. She was looking at her own hands on the reins, not at him. Her brow was furrowed, and she looked less like a composed woman and more like a person standing at the edge of something they cannot see the bottom of. "I do not know exactly," he said slowly, "but there are children in Abilene who need teaching. Mrs. Dunmore at the boarding house knows everyone in that town. She is a woman who gets things done, and I—" He stopped. She looked up at him. "I have some money saved," he said. "Not a great deal, but enough to see someone through a difficult start if they needed it. I am not saying that to be bold or to suggest anything improper. I am saying it because it is a fact that is available to you if you want to know it." Susanna Bishop sat very still on the chestnut mare in the Kansas summer, with Harlan Creed's stone house visible on the horizon, and the grass moving around her, and Daniel Bailey watching her with an expression he was working very hard to keep neutral. And she thought about her life with the particular clarity that open spaces sometimes produce. She thought about St. Louis, closed and finished. She thought about the letters from Harlan Creed, adequate, thorough, efficient, utterly without warmth. She thought about 2 days on the prairie and a storm-soaked barn, and stars too numerous to count, and a man who had covered her trembling hands with his, briefly and without making anything of it, and had said with complete plainness that she did not have to go. She looked at Daniel Bailey properly, the way she had not quite allowed herself to in the last 2 days, took in the whole of him, the lean, weathered steadiness of him, the way he had of being entirely present without imposing himself on the space around him, the careful honesty in everything he said. "You are making this very difficult," she said, and her voice had something in it she had not planned. "I know," he said. "I am sorry for it." "No, you are not," she said, and something in her voice had shifted, and they were looking at each other now the way people look at each other when the distance between them has suddenly become very clear and very specific. He almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "I suppose I am not." She took a breath. She looked at Creed's house on the horizon once more, the solid stone fact of it, the arranged life waiting in it. Then she looked at Daniel. "I would need to write to Mr. Creed," she said. "I would not simply disappear. That would not be right." "No," he said, "it would not. I will take the letter myself if you want." "That seems like rather a lot to ask of you." I offered. She was quiet again. The grass moved. A meadowlark called from somewhere close by, 3 ascending notes and then the long, elaborate song. "If I go back to Abilene," she said carefully, "I am relying on the kindness of people I barely know. I am relying on the possibility of work that may not materialize. I am relying on—" She stopped. "You can rely on me," he said. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said most things, and it landed on her with exactly that simplicity. Not a promise of anything beyond the plain meaning of the words. Just the words and the fact that he meant them completely. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned Dolly's head north, back toward Abilene, and she said without looking at him, "I would be grateful if you would come with me, Mr. Bailey." He sat still for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then he turned scout north beside her. "Daniel," he said. She glanced at him. "I beg your pardon. My name is Daniel." A pause and then that smile again, the brief, warm, involuntary one, and she said, "Susanna." They rode north together, and the grass moved around them, and the meadowlark sang, and the stone house on the southern horizon grew slowly smaller, and then disappeared behind the curve of the earth. He did ride to Creed's ranch, but he did it alone, and the following day, with a carefully written letter from Susanna in his coat pocket, and the full, clear understanding that he might not be entirely welcome. He left Susanna with Mrs. Dunmore, who took in the situation with the experienced eye of a woman who had seen a great many situations, and said only that the spare room was available for a reasonable weekly rate, and that there was indeed a school board in Abilene that had been looking for a teacher since the previous spring. Creed met him at the gate of the property, with the particular stillness of a man controlling a significant amount of anger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man of 44 with a gray-streaked beard and pale blue eyes that were not unkind exactly, but were entirely calculating, the eyes of someone who was always measuring what things were worth. Daniel gave him the letter without preamble. Creed read it without changing expression. Then he looked up at Daniel. "She changed her mind," he said flat. "She did. Because of you." Daniel looked at him directly. "She changed her mind because she chose to. I gave her the information that she had a choice. What she did with it was hers." Creed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I paid you to bring her here." "I know you did. I will return the money." Another silence. Then Creed said, with a precision that was more cold than angry, "Get off my land, Bailey." He got off Creed's land. He rode the 20 miles back to Abilene at a pace that reflected his mood, which was something he did not have a word for exactly, a compound of relief and uncertainty, and a warmth at the center of it that was new enough to feel slightly alarming. He found Susanna at Mrs. Dunmore's kitchen table, with a cup of tea and her notebook open, and Mrs. Dunmore sitting across from her, which was either a good sign or a significant one. Mrs. Dunmore looked up when he came in and gave him an expression of complex approval that she declined to elaborate on. "How did it go?" Susanna asked. "He was unhappy," Daniel said, pulling off his hat. "But he is a man who will find himself another arrangement. He has land and means, and what I think he mostly wanted was a practical addition to his household." He paused. "The letter was good. You said exactly the right things." She had written to Creed with honesty and care, acknowledging the arrangement they had made and her own change of heart, taking full responsibility for it, expressing genuine regret for any inconvenience and wishing him well without false sentiment. It was, Daniel thought, a model of how to write a difficult letter. "And now?" she said, looking at him. "And now," he said, "I believe Mrs. Dunmore mentioned a school board." Mrs. Clara Dunmore had not merely mentioned a school board. She had, apparently in the course of the morning, sent a note to 3 members of it, had a reply from 2 of them, and had arranged for Susanna to meet with the chairman of the board the following Tuesday. She accomplished all of this with the brisk efficiency of a woman who ran a household and a boarding house and a significant portion of Abilene's social fabric simultaneously, and she mentioned it with a modest air that fooled neither Daniel nor Susanna. "Mrs. Dunmore," Susanna said, "you are remarkable." "I am practical," Mrs. Dunmore said, refilling the teacups. "There is a difference, though it is a small one. Daniel stayed in Abilene." He had not precisely planned to, but when he thought about riding out for the next job, the next drive or the next survey contract, the thought felt flat and purposeless in a way it never had before, and he found reasons to remain. He had a standing arrangement with the livery man to help with horses, which was informal enough to leave his time largely his own, and he was owed a few weeks of wages from the last surveying contract, which meant he was not in any immediate financial difficulty. He called on Susanna at Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house with the increasing frequency that occurs naturally when two people find reasons to be in the same place. At first the visits were practical. He knew the town and its people. She needed to navigate both, and he was useful in the way that a person is useful when they know which merchants can be trusted and which board members respond well to directness. But the pretense of practicality wore thin fairly quickly because neither of them was particularly interested in maintaining pretenses. They walked in the evenings along the edge of town where the prairie began, that boundary between the human order of streets and buildings, and the wide, indifferent grass that stretched south and west without apology. Susanna always brought her notebook and sometimes wrote while they walked, which Daniel found endearing rather than distracting, and she had started lending him books from her wooden box, which he read in the evenings at the livery with the serious attention of a man who had been educated in a Missouri farmhouse and was aware of the gaps. He read them carefully and then they talked about them, and he was a good reader, careful and questioning, and she found talking to him about books deeply satisfying in the way that talking to someone who takes ideas seriously and brings their own experience to them is always satisfying. She met with the school board on the Tuesday Mrs. Dunmore had arranged, and came back to the boarding house with a letter of appointment and the look of someone who has had something important restored to them. The school was a modest building 2 streets from the main road, with 19 children enrolled and a promise of more when the outlying farm families felt comfortable sending their children in. The salary was not large, but it was dignified and steady, and it was hers. She told Daniel the news outside the boarding house in the early evening, and she was trying to be composed about it, but her eyes were bright, and her voice had an undercurrent of something she did not quite manage to contain. He put out his hand and she took it, and they stood there on the boardwalk outside Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house shaking hands with a formality that lasted approximately 3 seconds before she laughed, and he was smiling with his whole face in the way she had begun to understand was not common for him, and was, when it occurred, the most disarming thing she had encountered. The weeks that followed were some of the most specific, detailed, quietly extraordinary weeks either of them had lived. Abilene in the late summer of 1873 was a town in transition, the cattle trade still active but already less dominant than it had been, the town growing more permanent institutions alongside its rougher edges, churches and a proper school, and a Masonic lodge and women's charitable societies, and a newspaper that came out twice a week. Susanna threw herself into the school with the energy of someone given back their purpose. She knew how to do this, had always known how to do it, and the 19 children of Abilene's school found themselves in the hands of a teacher who expected a great deal of them and made them feel capable of it, which is the particular gift of the best teachers. Daniel watched this from a friendly distance that was becoming less distant by degrees, and felt something that he later recognized as pride, which surprised him, because she had done none of it in any relation to him, and he had no claim on any of it. And yet there it was, warm and specific, watching her walk into that small school building on a September morning with her bonnet tied and her books under her arm. He asked her to take supper with him at the hotel dining room on a Saturday in late September, and she accepted with a directness that matched his own. They sat across from each other at a table with a proper cloth and ate chicken and dumplings, which was what the hotel was doing that evening, and the conversation went easily and widely, ranging across the children in her school, and a land dispute Daniel was helping to mediate in a neighboring county on behalf of a farmer and the Anders family, whom Susanna had written to and received a warm reply from Martha. And books and the prairie and the weather and half a dozen other things that people talk about when they are entirely comfortable with each other and enjoy the comfort of it. Toward the end of the meal, in a natural pause, she looked at him across the table with an expression he had not seen before, something direct and slightly uncertain at once, and she said, "Daniel, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly." "I always answer you honestly," he said. "You do," she agreed. "That is one of the things that I value about you." She straightened slightly, the composure she used as architecture when she needed it. "When you told me I did not have to go to Creed's ranch, and when you said you would take me back to Abilene, was that because you felt some general, professional concern for my welfare? Or was it something more specific than that?" He looked at her steadily. He had known this question was coming, had been, in some part of his mind, waiting for it and deciding what he was going to say when it came. "It was something more specific," he said. She held his gaze. "How much more specific?" "Considerably," he said, the ghost of a smile. "Are you going to elaborate?" He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the full directness that was characteristic of him when he had decided to be honest about something. "Susanna, I think you are the most interesting person I have ever met. I think about talking to you when I am not talking to you, which is a new experience. I think about the prairie and whether you are looking at it at the same time I am, which is perhaps not entirely rational. I would like, if you are willing, to court you properly, and I understand if you would rather I did not, given everything, and I will not press the matter if your answer is no." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the hotel window, Abilene's Main Street was doing its evening business, horses and voices and the distant music from the saloon 2 blocks down, all the ordinary sounds of a frontier town in 1873 carrying on its ordinary life. "My answer is not no," she said. He breathed out slowly. "Good," he said, in a voice that was somewhat quieter than usual. "That is your entire response," she said, and her eyes were warm with amusement. "I am working up to more," he said, and she laughed, and there it was again, that warm and unguarded sound that had been, if he was honest with himself, which he now was, one of the primary organizing facts of the last several weeks of his life. He courted her with the particular seriousness he brought to everything he cared about. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie on Sunday mornings, not an arrangement but a specific small bunch, the kind of flowers that were interesting individually, a variety of grama grass flower alongside a late-blooming prairie aster alongside a cutting of goldenrod, and she pressed them in one of her books, which he noticed, and said nothing about because it made his chest do something pleasant. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, out onto the open prairie where the grass was turning to its autumn colors, the gold deepening toward amber, and they rode and talked, and occasionally just rode in the companionable silence that had been there from the beginning. He was a patient and respectful man in his courtship, which was not calculated. It was simply his nature, but it meant that by mid-October Susanna was occasionally frustrated by his patience, which she privately found both admirable and somewhat maddening. The resolution of this frustration came on an October afternoon when they had ridden out to a particular rise she had come to love, from which you could see the Smoky Hill River winding through the valley below, and the grass going all the way to the sky. They had sat in the grass watching the sun move, and Daniel had been reading to her from a novel she had lent him, one of Mr. Dickens's, which he read well with a natural sense of the language, and he was in the middle of a paragraph when she put her hand on his arm and he looked up and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before on her face, wholly unguarded, everything composure held back showing freely, and she said, "Daniel, stop reading." He closed the book, and she leaned forward and kissed him, which was somewhat unexpected and completely perfect. He kissed her back with the focused, genuine attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, and his hand came up to her face carefully, and they stayed like that in the October grass with the river in the valley below and the sky enormous above them until Susanna sat back and looked at him with color in her cheeks and her eyes bright. "I have been waiting for you to do that," she said. "I was being respectful," he said. "I know you were," she said. "I appreciate it, but there are limits to appreciation." He laughed then, fully and freely, and she looked at him with an expression of startled pleasure because she had not often heard him laugh that fully, and she said, "That is what I have been working toward," and he laughed again. October deepened into November, and the Kansas prairie moved toward winter with its own majestic efficiency, the grass going to brown and gold, and the cottonwood leaves turning yellow and dropping in the wind, the sky taking on the pale, clear quality of autumn light. It got cold early that year, with frost on the grass in the mornings and the horse's breath making clouds in the dawn. Susanna's school was in full session, with 23 children now, the number growing as word spread among the farm families that there was a genuine teacher in Abilene and she was good. She was. Daniel occasionally walked by the school at midday and heard her voice through the window, reading or explaining or asking questions in the Socratic way she had, and he would stand on the boardwalk for a moment just listening with his hat in his hand and then walk on, because a man cannot stand outside a schoolhouse window indefinitely without attracting comment. He had found himself work with a small cattle operation east of town, a decent man named Tolliver who needed a reliable hand for the winter months to help manage stock and keep the fences and generally maintain the place, while Tolliver himself dealt with some legal matters in Topeka. It was not exciting work, but it was honest, and it kept Daniel occupied and solvent, which were both relevant concerns now that he had intentions that extended beyond his own next meal. He had been thinking about those intentions with increasing seriousness through October and into November, turning them over the way he turned over all significant decisions, carefully and from multiple angles, testing them for soundness. He had never been a man who rushed into things, but he had also never been a man who confused patience with postponement, and he knew what he wanted with a certainty that was, by this point, not in any question. He spoke to Mrs. Dunmore first, because Mrs. Dunmore knew Susanna in the particular way that landladies know the people they house, and because he respected her judgment, and also because he suspected that if he did not speak to her first, she would find a way to let him know he should have. Mrs. Dunmore listened to him with her hands folded in her lap and her expression alert, and when he had finished she said, "It is about time, Mr. Bailey," which he took as the approval it clearly was. He took Susanna walking on a Sunday evening in late November when the air was sharp and clear, and the first stars were beginning to show in the east, and they walked to the edge of town where the prairie opened, and the grass was dry and cold around them, and the sky was deepening from indigo to black, and he stopped walking and turned to face her. She looked at him with the amber eyes that had been one of the first things he had seen of her in the stagecoach office in September, and she had an expression of waiting that said she knew what was coming and was not in any doubt about what her answer would be. He said, "Susanna, I will not be eloquent about this because I am not an eloquent man, but I will be honest, which I hope is more useful." He held her eyes. "I was supposed to deliver you to a different man, and I could not make myself finish that ride, and every day since I have known I was right not to. You are the person I want to talk to every morning and at the end of every day and in all the spaces between. I want to build a life with you in this country that is still figuring out what it wants to be, and I think we might figure it out alongside it. If you will marry me, I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that I turned scout around." She stood in the November evening with the stars beginning to populate the enormous Kansas sky above her, and Daniel Bailey in front of her with his hat in his hands and his eyes entirely honest. And she thought about a gray September morning in Abilene when she had arrived with a battered trunk and a reticule holding everything she had, and about how far that felt from here, and about how little of that distance was geographical. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He put his hat on the ground and took her face in both hands and kissed her with all the seriousness and warmth and attention that was characteristic of him. And she kissed him back with both hands against his chest and her eyes closed, and the prairie spread out around them in all its dark, cold, star-attended splendor. They were married in December, 2 days before Christmas, at the small Methodist church on 2nd Street, which was the only church in Abilene that had a minister in permanent residence that year. Mrs. Dunmore was there in her best dress, and Eric and Martha Anders made the winter ride from their homestead, which moved Susanna considerably when she saw them come through the door. Tolliver came, and several of the school board members, and most of Susanna's 23 students were crammed into the back pews with their parents, which had not been formally arranged, but which no one had the heart to prevent. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole, who performed the ceremony with sincere attention and very little superfluous ornamentation, which both Daniel and Susanna appreciated. They stood together in front of the altar and said the words clearly and meant all of them, and when the minister said the final words and they were married, Daniel took her face in his hands in front of everyone and kissed her in a way that was not strictly church appropriate, but which the assembled guests greeted with warmth and in some cases applause. Mrs. Anders cried. Mrs. Dunmore did not, but her eyes were bright. Daniel had arranged, in the practical and thorough way he arranged all significant things, for their first home. It was not large, but it was sound, a 2-room house at the western edge of Abilene, stone on the lower half and timber on the upper, with a kitchen and a main room and a good fireplace and enough land around it to keep a horse and a kitchen garden. He had spent 3 weeks of November work on it, patching and fixing and making it what it should be, and he had not shown it to Susanna until he was satisfied with it. When he brought her to it on the evening of their wedding, she walked through the rooms with her hand trailing over the walls, quiet and absorbing, and he stood in the doorway watching her and not saying anything. She stopped in the middle of the main room where he had put the small pot-bellied stove and the table and the 2 chairs he had found at the second-hand goods dealer, and she turned to look at him. "You made this for me," she said. "Not a question." "For us," he said. She crossed the room and put her arms around him in the straightforward, wholehearted way she did things now that she was not performing composure, and he held her in the first home they had together with his face against her hair and the Kansas winter outside, and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that it was almost unfamiliar. Winter in Kansas was not gentle. It came down from the north with its full force, the blizzards that swept the prairie white and made the world small, the temperatures that dropped in the nights to places that demanded respect. But their small stone house held its warmth, and they were comfortable in it with the practical, inventive domesticity of 2 people who were good at managing material realities, and enjoyed doing it together. Susanna kept teaching through the winter, bundled in her wool coat and boots, her breath making clouds all the way to the school. Daniel continued with Tolliver's place and picked up additional work wherever it presented itself, helping a neighbor build a fence line, assisting with a difficult calving operation for a rancher to the north, the flexible, skilled labor of a man who knew animals and land and hard weather. Their evenings were the best thing about that winter. The house was small enough that they were always close to each other, always aware of the other person's presence in the particular good way that people are aware of warmth. They read together by firelight, Susanna teaching him to play cards with the patient pedagogical skill she applied to everything, Daniel showing her how to track weather in the behavior of the prairie grass and the movement of birds. They cooked together, which was not conventional for the time but which was practical given their schedules, and which they both found they enjoyed. They talked constantly, with the deep, ranging, pleasureful conversation of 2 people who find each other genuinely interesting, and they did not run out of things to say to each other, not in that whole long winter, not then and not later either. Spring came in March with the first brave green pushing through the winter-brown grass, and the meadowlarks returned, and the prairie opened again into its wide, breathing presence. Susanna stood on the step of their stone house on the first genuinely warm morning of the year and turned her face to the sun with her eyes closed. And Daniel watched her from the doorway with the particular kind of love that has settled into the bone and is no longer surprising itself, but is still, every time, astonishing. She turned and saw him watching and smiled at him with the full, unguarded smile that she had arrived at over the winter, a smile that had nothing of the careful composure of the stagecoach office and everything of the woman who had laughed in Eric Anders's barn. "Spring," she said. "Spring," he agreed, and came out to stand beside her on the step. That spring brought with it a number of changes. The cattle trade continued its gradual westward shift, and Abilene began its evolution from a cattle town into a more settled community, with new businesses and more families and the slow accumulation of permanents. The school grew to 31 students by April, and Susanna applied to the board for a second teacher, a young woman she had heard of in Salina who held a teaching certificate from Ohio, and the board approved it, which made Susanna happy in a specific administrative way that Daniel understood perfectly, because he had watched her build the school and loved watching it. He had been thinking carefully through the winter about his own future and its practical shape. The hired hand work was good and honest, but it was not a direction, and he was 31 years old with a wife and a home, and the specific ambition that comes from having something to build toward. He spoke to Eric Anders about it, in the direct way the two men had developed over the months of correspondence and a couple of visits, and Eric, who had built his own operation from a Homestead Act claim and nothing else, was practical and encouraging and pointed Daniel toward a section of land 8 miles west of Abilene that had been claimed, and then abandoned by a family that had gone back east the previous fall. The land was good, a mix of bottom land and rise, with a creek running through it and the evidence of decent grass, and the claim could be taken up under the Homestead Act for the filing fee and the obligation to work it. Daniel took Susanna to see it on a Sunday in April, riding out through the new spring grass with the sky enormous and clear above them. He stopped on the rise that looked down over the whole section, the creek glinting in the bottom, the grass moving, the long view in every direction that he had always loved, and he told her what he was thinking. She sat on Dolly, who was her horse now by universal agreement, and looked at the land below and around, and he could see her looking at it the way she looked at things she was taking seriously, absorbing and measuring. "It is a great deal of work," she said. "Yes. We would have to build a proper house, eventually. Yes. In the meantime, there is a serviceable structure already. I have seen it, a good one-room cabin and a sound barn." She looked at the land for a long time, then she looked at him. "Could we keep the house in town while the school is what it is, until it is fully in hand?" "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "We keep the town house, I file the claim and work the land through the week, come in on weekends. When the time is right, we make the move properly, but the claim would be ours." She nodded slowly, and then she smiled, that broad, warm smile. "Daniel Bailey, you want to be a rancher." "I want to be a rancher," he agreed. "Then let us be ranchers," she said, and there was something in the easy, wholehearted way she said it. Let us. That was one of the most quietly perfect things he had ever heard. He filed the Homestead Act claim in May of 1874, paying the $14 filing fee at the land office in Abilene with the deliberate care of a man placing a foundation stone, and rode out to the west section in the early morning with a load of tools and a clear head and an amount of happiness that was, if he was honest, somewhat embarrassing. The work was immense. The land had been left for a season and needed attention, the fences broken in several places, the creek crossing needing a new bridge, the cabin requiring new chinking and a repaired roof. Daniel worked it with the methodical endurance of a man who had been doing physical labor since childhood and understood the relationship between sustained effort and result. He hired 2 men from town when he needed an extra pair of hands, a young fellow named Charlie who was 17 and willing, and a Mexican man named Louis who was quiet and skilled and knew cattle well. Susanna came out on Saturdays sometimes, riding Dolly the 8 miles with her bonnet on and her practical dress and her boots, and she worked alongside him with the cheerful, specific competence she brought to things she decided to take seriously. She had strong opinions about where the kitchen garden should go and about the layout of the future house, opinions which she expressed clearly, and which Daniel took seriously and largely agreed with. In the evenings when they were both at the west section, they sat outside the cabin in the summer dusk and looked at their land in the particular proprietary silence of people who have worked hard for something and feel the substance of it. In the evenings in town, through the spring and into the summer, they talked about the future with the pleasure of people who believe in it. They wanted children, had talked about this with the honest directness that characterized their whole way with each other, and they wanted them in the way that people want something they have thought about seriously and feel ready for. The news came in August of 1874. Susanna told him on a Sunday morning in their kitchen house in town, matter of fact, and with the brightness in her eyes that she could not entirely contain. And Daniel sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at her. She was standing with her cup of tea, watching him. In the spring, he said, March, I believe, perhaps early April. He stood up and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her with the careful, warm, entirely intentional embrace of a man who understands that the person he is holding is the most important thing in his life. All right, he said into her hair. All right, she repeated with amusement. Extraordinarily all right, he corrected, and she laughed, and he held her tighter. They made their plans with the specific, grounded care that their situation required. The school board had been understanding when Susanna had described her situation, and had agreed that she would continue through the fall and as much of the winter as was reasonable, and that her position would be held for her, the newer teacher carrying the school through the gap. Daniel accelerated the work on the west section, driving himself through the fall to get the land in order, with Louis's help building a second room onto the cabin that would serve as a proper bedroom when they made the move. He was out there more days than not, riding back to town in the evenings with the particular tiredness of a man building something, which is different from ordinary physical tiredness, because it carries its own satisfaction inside it. October that year was gold and clear and perfect, the kind of Kansas October that makes the harshness of winter feel like a foreign concept. They rode out to the west section together on a Sunday afternoon when the light was long and amber, and the grass was every shade between green and gold and brown, and they stood together on the rise above the land, and Daniel had his arm around her shoulders and Susanna had both hands resting on the small, remarkable roundness that was the new Bailey, and they looked at their land in the autumn light. I want to call it the Bishop Bailey Ranch, she said, or the Bailey Bishop Ranch. I cannot decide which sounds better, he considered. Bailey Bishop, he said, it has the better rhythm. It does, she agreed. Bailey Bishop Ranch, she tried the full form, tasting it. I like it. So do I. She leaned against him. The autumn light lay over the grass and the creek and the sky in that extraordinary way that only the Great Plains manage, warm and vast and entirely without any interest in whether the people standing in it were aware of being lucky. They were aware. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was difficult, which winters in Kansas generally were. But their cabin on the west section was warm, and their stores were adequate, and Louis and Charlie were good men who knew their responsibilities. Susanna came through the worst of the cold months with the practical, uncomplaining endurance that was deeply characteristic of her, and Daniel watched over her with a careful attentiveness that she accepted with more grace than she might have 6 months earlier, because she understood by now that his care was not an implication that she could not manage, but an expression of something he did not always say in words. On the 14th of March, 1875, In their cabin on the west section with the assistance of a midwife named Mrs. Helen Pryor, who had come out from Abilene the previous afternoon at Daniel's anxious insistence, Susanna brought a son into the world. He was, from the first moment, emphatically present, with a voice that suggested strong opinions and a grasping strength in his small hands that made the midwife laugh. He had Susanna's dark hair, which was already visible as a dark cap on his round head, and Daniel's jaw even at that improbable age, which Mrs. Pryor announced with the authority of a woman who had attended a considerable number of births. Daniel held his son in the early morning light of the cabin in the hour after, when Mrs. Pryor was doing her tidying, and Susanna was resting with her eyes half closed, but a smile on her face that was different from any smile he had seen before, deeper and more permanent. He held the small, warm weight of his boy and looked down at the face that was already its own face, already its own specific person, and felt something so large and uncomplicated that he did not try to name it. James, Susanna said, without opening her eyes, using the name they had agreed on weeks ago. James Daniel Bailey. James Daniel Bailey, he said, trying it on the morning air. It fit. It was exactly right. He looked up from the baby to Susanna, who had opened her eyes now and was watching him with the full, warm look that was only for him. "Thank you," he said. "I believe we both had some involvement," she said. He smiled. Still, she agreed. The spring of 1875 came, and the Bailey Bishop Ranch came further into its own. They made the permanent move from the town house to the west section in April, when the weather was settled and James was 6 weeks old, and demonstrating a hearty interest in the whole world around him. Susanna kept her connection to the school, riding in 2 days a week when she could, consulting with the newer teacher who was more than capable by now and who had become a genuine colleague. They built the larger house that summer, not the grand stone house of Harlan Creed, but a good honest home of Kansas limestone and timber, 4 rooms and a covered porch that ran along the south side, where the afternoon light was best. Susanna had specific opinions about the porch, which she had expressed throughout the planning in the clear, direct way she had, and Daniel had built it exactly as she described, a wide porch with a bench along the wall and a clear view south over the land. They sat on that porch in the evenings when the day's work was done, in the summer with the meadowlarks and the long light and James sitting on the boards between them, discovering the world at ground level with the systematic determination of a child who takes his investigations seriously. Susanna wrote in her notebook, and Daniel read the newspaper that came twice a week from Abilene or one of the books from her steadily growing collection. And the warm, ordinary, extraordinary fact of their evenings together was something neither of them ever took for granted. Eric Anders and his family visited in the fall of 1875, making the long ride from their homestead, and Martha held James and said he had his father's look and his mother's disposition, which she meant as an unqualified compliment. Eric and Daniel walked the land in the way of men who respect land and respect each other, talking about cattle prices and water rights and the shifting economics of Kansas, as the cattle trade continued its westward migration, and both of them knew they were laying the groundwork for a long friendship. Harlan Creed's name came up once briefly, when Eric mentioned that Creed had sold the southern portion of his land and taken a new wife the previous spring, a widow from Ellsworth with grown children. Daniel received this information with the equanimity of someone for whom it was simply a fact about the world, and Susanna, when he told her that evening, nodded once and said, "I hope they suit each other," and meant it genuinely, and they did not speak of it again. The years moved forward with the good, accumulating weight of years that are well lived. The ranch grew carefully and steadily, never in a hurry, always with the attention to detail that both of them brought to things. Daniel built up a small herd of mixed cattle, good solid animals, and kept 4 horses besides Dolly and Scout, and added a pair of working dogs that James was immediately devoted to and who were equally devoted to him. James Bailey grew into a boy of bright, particular intelligence, and a physical confidence that delighted his father and occasionally alarmed his mother. He was 4 years old when the second child came, a girl they named Clara after Mrs. Dunmore, who had died the previous year, and left both of them with a genuine grief. Clara was quieter than James but not less present, a child with her mother's observant eyes and her father's steadiness, who learned to read at 3 years old and was managing sentences at 4. They had one more after Clara, born in 1881 when Susanna was 33, and the ranch was 8 years established, and the prairie around them was filling up with more homesteads and more families, and the slow, imperfect, continuing work of people making their lives in a new country. The third was a boy they named Thomas Eric Bailey, the middle name for Eric Anders, who was by then their oldest friend and godfather to all 3 children, and who received the honor with the large, warm, Norwegian-American dignity that was entirely his own. By the time Thomas was old enough to sit his first horse, which he attempted at the age of 2 with a determination that the horse, a very patient creature named Biscuit, bore with admirable resignation, the Bailey Bishop Ranch was a genuine, working, viable operation. It was not the largest ranch in that part of Kansas, not anything close to Creed's scale in his prime, but it was honest and solid, and it was theirs, which was what they had always wanted of it. The town of Abilene had grown and changed around them in the meantime, the wildness of its early cattle trade years giving way to a more settled character as the railheads moved further west and the population stabilized into something more permanently rooted. Susanna continued her connection to the school through the 1870s, moving from active teaching to something more advisory as her family, and the ranch demanded more of her time, but she never entirely let go of it, because it was part of what she was, and she had learned not to let go of the parts of herself that mattered. She still wrote in her notebooks, which by the later years had accumulated into a considerable collection, volumes of observation and thought, and the record of a life, the particular record that her schoolteacher's habit of noticing things had built up over the years into something substantial and real. Daniel had built her a shelf for them in the room she used for writing, the south-facing room in their limestone house where the light in the mornings was good. On an evening in the fall of 1882, when James was 7 and Clara was 3 and Thomas was barely walking and the harvest was in, and the cattle were settled for the season, and the work had come to one of its periodic natural pauses, Daniel and Susanna sat on the south porch in the last warmth of the October sun. The prairie around them was in its autumn colors, gold and amber and the deep brown of dried grass, the same colors that had marked their first autumn together, the same grass, the same sky, the same meadowlark territory, some descendant of the same bird probably. Susanna had her notebook in her lap, but she was not writing. She was looking at the land the way she often looked at it now, with the settled, warm attention of a person who knows a thing deeply and is glad of it. Daniel was watching her with the same attention he had given her since the first morning he rode out of Abilene, that particular quality of attention that had never dimmed. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She turned to look at him. The amber eyes were the same as they had always been, unchanged, the look in them everything he had ever needed. "I am thinking," she said, "about a woman who arrived in Abilene with one trunk and a box of books and almost nothing else, and who was terrified and pretending not to be, and who was being taken to a life she had arranged because she could not think what else to do." She paused. "And about the man who turned around." "I could not make myself keep writing," he said. "I know," she said. "I have thought about that many times, that you simply could not." She reached over and put her hand over his, which was resting on the porch bench between them, and he turned his hand and held hers. "I am grateful every day." "So am I," he said. They sat in the October afternoon with their hands joined, and the prairie spread before them, and the sounds of their children inside the house. James explaining something to Clara with the elder sibling authority of a 7-year-old, who is not always right but is always confident, and Thomas, who was probably trying to climb something he should not be climbing. The wind moved through the autumn grass with that sound she had described on their first night under the stars together, a sound like breathing, like the land itself drawing breath. The cottonwoods by the creek had gone gold, and the sky was the deep, clear blue of a Kansas October, and the meadowlark sang from somewhere in the grass, 3 notes ascending, and then the long, uncontainable song. Daniel Bailey looked at his wife in the afternoon light and felt, as he had felt in varying forms since a gray September morning in a stagecoach office, the settled and astonishing certainty that there was nowhere else he was supposed to be, nothing else he was supposed to be doing, no version of his life that was more true than this one. He had turned scout around at the edge of Creed's land and ridden north, and the whole rest of his life had followed from that turn, from the inability to finish a ride he should never have started, and the inability was the best thing he had ever done. The meadowlark sang on in the October grass, the prairie rolled to the horizon in every direction, and the man and the woman who had found each other at the edge of a different life sat together in the warmth of what they had built, entirely and finally home. Inside the house, Thomas Bailey, who was 20 months old and had his grandmother's stubbornness and his grandfather's eyes, managed to climb up onto a chair and then onto the kitchen table and stand there with the triumphant expression of someone who has achieved a significant summit, while his sister looked up at him from the floor below, and his brother told him firmly to get down before Mama saw, which was excellent advice given in complete confidence that it would be ignored. And Susanna heard the particular quality of the resulting noise and rose from the bench with the automatic readiness of a mother who knows her children's sounds and what they each mean, and she said, "That is Thomas," in a tone that contained both resignation and amusement, and Daniel was already standing, and they went inside together, back into the warm, lamplit interior of their home on the Kansas prairie, into the beautiful, ordinary life they had made, and the door closed behind them on the autumn evening. And the meadowlark sang, and the grass moved, and the stars were already beginning to show in the eastern sky, enormous and particular and entirely indifferent to everything except the vast, excellent fact of being there,